Hello listeners, and welcome to this episode of the NK News Podcast, recorded here in Seoul on Friday, September 14, 2018. It's a rough and ready roundtable podcast today with Chad O'Carroll and Oliver Hotham, just back from a long trip to North Korea. And don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, you can find all of our news stories and analysis on nknews.org. And if you're already a subscriber of nknews.org, consider upgrading to NK Pro, where you'll find all of our more extended analysis and excellent research and analysis tools for understanding the situation on the Korean Peninsula better. So, Chad and Oliver, welcome. Welcome back, I should say.
Thank you.
Good to be back.
How long were you there for?
We were there from Wednesday, the 5th of September, until Wednesday, the 12th of September, yesterday. So we're fresh back and looking forward to sharing all of our experiences and insights with you from this trip.
Excellent. Now, the purpose of your trip was to go there for the 70th anniversary founding parade. 70th anniversary of the founding of the Republic celebrations. Is that right?
That's right. And all the surrounding events. You know, we knew ahead of time that there was going to be a military parade. There were a lot of questions about whether or not North Korea would choose to show its ICBMs at that event. There were a lot of questions about whether or not Chinese President Xi Jinping would appear. And we also knew there was going to be a mass games, the Glorious Fatherland, Brilliant Fatherland. There were about 5 different translations going around. So we knew that there was going to be some fireworks, literally and metaphorically. And so that was kind of the primary reason for going, but we also wanted to just go into the country. It had been over a year since we'd been. So
yeah. Well, it's good to see it at least once a year to keep up with the changes, isn't it? Now, 70 years of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. That's obviously a big day. They like to celebrate the 5 and 10 years, just like in the West, I suppose, in North Korea. You mentioned the parade. Let's start with that. You called it a military parade. What was the level of militariness of the parade?
So there were tens of thousands of troops, various types, everything from volunteer-style historical uniforms to modern special forces. They all came marching through much in the same way as to April 2017 when we were there. But then the hardware rolled out, and while there was a lot of artillery, number of tanks, when the sort of more heavy weaponry came out, all we really saw were 3 or 4, I believe it was, types of surface-to-air missiles, ship-to-ship missiles, really quite small fry from the tactical and strategic weapons perspective. We saw no short range, like Scud type missiles. We saw no intermediate range missiles such as the Hwasong 12, which had been showcased in prior parades recently. And of course, the big thing that all journalists were really looking out for was the ICBM class of missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and we didn't see any of those either. So that was a big relief, I think, for parts of the international community, certainly South Korea, the United States. But it was quite remarkable to see that the DPRK held back on that, because some observers had been anticipating them to roll out the big heavy stuff because of language in the Panmunjom Declaration and in the Singapore Summit Agreement, which didn't exactly precisely commit DPRK to not doing things like showcasing its extended range delivery systems.
But I think if they had showed them, it would not have been in the spirit of either of those agreements, really. And you can always rely on your minders for a pithy quote, but right after the ICBMs didn't roll past and it became clear that they weren't going to, I asked one of the minders, so is this a peaceful gesture? And he said, you guessed it.
You guessed it. Wow, that's interesting. Now, the soldiers, do they march in battle dress uniforms, or is it more of the formal non-battle, I don't even know what to call it, but the non-battle uniforms?
So some at the start, when they're doing the flag raising ceremony, were in that more uniform style, but most were it seemed to be in the kind of battle ready, especially the special forces with the face paint.
They had the face paint too.
Yeah, and it was a really hot day, so to be carrying all that gear around covered in really dark face paint would have been pretty intense in the sun.
Now, there was a parade, I can't remember exactly when, but let's say a couple of years ago, a parade in which some of those guys in the camouflage uniforms were wearing backpacks with radioactive symbols on them to almost symbolize human nuclear dirty bombs, perhaps. At least that's how they were interpreted by some in the West media. Did you see those guys with their backpacks and the nuclear symbols again this time?
No, we didn't. There weren't really that many references to nuclear weapons at all in the parade. There was, I think, the only rocket that appeared was on a float about education, and there was a little rocket above some cute-looking school children.
I think I saw in a diorama at a school I was taken to in April last year. A very similar rocket.
Yeah, and interestingly, while not something that we would have expected in the parade itself, but in the mass games event later on that night, no reference to space exploration, to satellite launch capabilities, and in general, like that topic was really not visible at all in any of the like domestic posters. And as you know, that part of North Korea's scientific aspiration has always been quite prominent in the past. So it seems they're also aware in the DPRK of the criticism that comes in some parts of the arms control community that these space launch vehicles pose as present a way for the DPRK to do long-range missile testing undercover.
That's very interesting messaging. We should talk a bit more about that, about messaging in general. I understand that there was a photograph that showed President Moon of South Korea in the parade.
Yeah, that was in the mass games in the evening.
Not the parade, but the mass games.
Yeah, it was pretty remarkable because there was a Tongil unification sign that came up, and after that the human pixels gave way to, I think they must have all put up black pixels so that like moving images could be projected onto it, and then there was this slow motion video of Moon and Kim embracing each other and very warm inter-Korean feelings.
There was a lot of applause, and it was all very heartwarming.
I also heard from someone that there was some of the slogans in the parade were translated into English.
Yeah. Towards the end,
not in the parade, in the mass games.
Yeah,
okay.
They had this at the end. They had these kind of old school kind of non-aligned movement slogans about international solidarity, multilateral diplomacy,
good neighborliness,
which we thought was very much a reference to no more nuclear tests.
Yeah, because China always stresses about those.
Yeah.
But yeah, that did seem a bit of a nod to all the friendship groups who were there to make them feel like it was worthwhile visiting.
And then there was this kind of diorama of all these Koreans in sort of different national dresses, all kind of dancing with each other. So there were some people in like traditional Spanish clothes, and it was all very
and someone African, right?
Yeah, there was a bit of blackface. Which
seriously?
Yeah.
Oh dear.
Which, I mean, it's North Korea.
Well, yeah, they haven't quite caught up with.
That stuff often appears on South Korean TV. So.
I know, sometimes that's true. Did you see any signs in either the parade or at the mass games of anti-Americanism?
No, actually, no. Sorry, there was. Yes, on some of the tanks that rolled through Kim Il-sung Square, they have very small hand-painted Korean text slogans just on the front. Really, you wouldn't really notice them unless you're looking at a zoomed-in photo, and our colleague Colin spotted some anti-American...
Just says, let us destroy the enemy, the imperialist US aggressors.
Well, it does sound like a very muted... a different messaging compared to what we've seen in the past, even as recently as the February Army Day parade. What do we make of all this? How do we interpret this messaging? What are they trying to achieve?
Well, I thought it was interesting. It was kind of the first time that we've seen the North Koreans kind of flip the messaging a little bit. So in the past, you go to North Korea and you kind of just always hear the same things, right? About American aggression and the state of war and all this stuff. But the North Koreans really seem to have kind of tried to tailor a message for international journalists. And that message was essentially about diplomacy. They were very keen to talk about how there were no more anti-US posters on the streets, and you'd ask them about that and they'd say, well, those posters will be gone as long as diplomacy continues. We went to the International Friendship Exhibition, and there was one room that was just full of pictures of Kim Jong-un meeting with Moon Jae-in and Donald Trump. And they were also very keen to emphasize this economic angle. So they're essentially, in April, Kim Jong-un made this speech where he said, our nuclear program is complete. We're just going to focus on the economy now. And they are really, really pushing that. Almost everyone you would speak to on the streets would mention it. North Koreans minders would talk about it all the time. And then in the visits that we went, factories, schools with new technology, they were really trying to promote this idea that, well, now we're shifting towards economic development, which was interesting in that that's what they're trying to emphasize, but also interesting in the fact that they were able to kind of have a new message, and that they clearly kind of worked on, this is going to be our message, which is kind of rare for North Korea to.
But at the same time, there were a few things we did see that were almost either relics from the past or suggest there could be some kind of outer inner track of domestic facing propaganda. So, for example, in one of the factories we went to, just around the corner, there was a big poster which had the Hwasong 15 ICBM on it. Inside, next to the cafeteria, we saw photos of the Hwasong 12 and some rocket artillery system. And one of our colleagues from Reuters, I think it was at the cosmetics factory, he lost his minders and went upstairs and opened a door and just walked into a room just full of anti-American propaganda, tried to take photos, and the minders were stopping him. So you got to wonder, and one of the diplomats we spoke to in the DPRK also said he'd seen about 20 cases of anti-American stuff in the last month or so, sort of hidden away. And it does raise a question: is it for show? Is it just a mistake? There's obviously so much to cleanse, but you'd think that factories that journalists are being taken to would really have a deep scrub of all that stuff, if that is the clear message that they need to project.
One would expect that. How many foreign journalists, roughly speaking, did you see there?
There was 130 in total, maybe from about 60 or 70 outlets, I'd say. And a lot of friendship groups as well. Everything from the wildly sycophantic groups to more, left-leaning anti-imperialist struggle type stuff.
And we were all together in the Yanggakdo Hotel. They cleared out that hotel of tourists, put them all in the Koryo, the little smaller ones. So it was mainly just, that hotel was just international press and the friendship groups.
Which was an interesting mix.
Is that poor shark still swimming around in the aquarium there by the bar in the lobby?
It's all sturgeon now. And apparently you can order them in the Unjong Tea House. You can order them and have a raw sturgeon of some sort.
With your tea?
Yeah.
They've got a new thing in that cafe that we didn't have last time. We've got a spaghetti that's actually quite good.
Was the parade live broadcast within North Korea, as far as you know?
No, it wasn't. It was broadcast the day after.
It took, I think, until Monday morning. So it took place on Sunday morning, and they broadcast it on Monday morning.
With a highlights package or the whole thing?
It was the whole thing.
Okay.
Much better angles than we had.
How long was the parade?
2 hours. 2 hours. And the mass games, I think, was about 2 hours as well. I don't know if they had any. Did they do coverage of that on KCTV, the mass games? They must have done.
I didn't see any, but I'm assuming they did.
Yeah.
Now, roughly speaking, how many people participated in the parade itself? Does it look like a lot?
I heard one estimate of 200,000 by Vice News. I don't know, I would say high tens of thousands.
Yeah.
It didn't seem like hundreds of thousands because it felt shorter. So yeah.
Now it was a daytime parade, wasn't it?
Yes.
Was there a torch-lit element?
That was in the evening, and we didn't actually go to that part.
Was that a separate parade?
That was on. That was on Monday evening.
Yeah.
That was a separate thing that we chose. We chose not to attend.
Okay, but you could have if you'd wanted to. Is that?
Oh yeah, very
so
much.
it wasn't just for internal.
No.
No. Okay. They wanted journalists to go to it, and actually some of One colleague I spoke to who did attend said it was actually really stunning. One of the most, quote, beautiful things, unquote, they've ever seen. So
it is a remarkable. So if anyone hasn't seen the 1988 documentary by Andrzej Fidek, the Polish documentary maker, called The Parade, I think you can find it on YouTube or clips of it. It's certainly quite something to see. But those torches themselves, they must be. There's a lot of fire involved there. Is there a danger?
Yeah,
sorry, go on, Chad.
Yeah, we did manage to see one that was like left over on the street, and it was like this tightly bound paper, like wrapped round and round, like really thin paper wrapped just hundreds of times around itself. And I'm guessing it's been coated with some kind of wax type thing that burns slowly, and then to protect the children's hands, each one appeared to have like this round circle that, when we looked closely, was made of like cigarette packets that had been sort of cut in a shape and sort of glued together with tape and stuff.
There were a lot of fire engines in Pyongyang that evening, just on standby if anything went wrong.
How old are the children carrying these torches?
I mean, it varied. We saw adults, kind of students, and then we saw children possibly as young as 10.
Gosh.
I'd say. Yeah. I mean, it's a lot of fumes for them to be breathing in as well.
And a fire danger too. Now, what about international dignitaries? Who was there to watch this parade and give support to North Korea to congratulate them on their 70th anniversary?
Well, there was obviously China's third in command.
Li Zhanshu was there, the member of the Standing Committee of the Political Bureau of the Communist Party of China. It's a long title, but as you said, he's number 3 in the protocol.
Yeah, I think there was probably a lot of disappointment on the North Korean side that the Chinese president chose not to come. But there was a lot of reports ahead of the event that he would attend. But ultimately, a big angle of the parade and the surrounding events was the DPRK China relationship. At the end of the parade, Kim Jong-un and Mr. Lee sort of stood hand in hand. They put their hands up, inter-Korean summit style. At all of the events, the Chinese delegate was right next to the leader. It was all clearly about reaffirming that relationship.
And there was also the president of Mauritania, and the head of Russia's Federative Council was there as well. Senior Cuban figure, I forget who that was. And then Syria sent a presidential delegation as well, who was also on the podium, I think.
So some of the old, long-standing friends of North Korea.
Some of the old comrades,
Yeah, and a very mysterious-looking woman from some Gulf country, I think, who was wearing like these long sort of light-coloured dress with sunglasses, looking straight out of the 1970s, just standing actually for most of the parade, looking down onto the square.
Did she have a hair covering?
She did, yes. Yeah.
What about the non-aligned movement? Did that make a reappearance?
Well, there was a in the Young Actor, I interviewed the head South African delegate, the Minister of Transport, who was there kind of for 2 reasons. He said he was there because the South African ruling party obviously has a long relationship with the North, because the North gave them help in the old apartheid era. And then he also said that as Minister of Transport, he was interested in some degree of cooperation with the North on
I wonder what that would look like. Would that be North Korea investing North Korea investing in South African transport infrastructure?
So he said, they've done very impressive things with the new trams there and buses, and he was kind of interested in learning a bit more about that, which was a little bit strange, but interesting nonetheless.
That is certainly interesting. And of course, the Korea Friendship Association, you mentioned them, the long-standing fanboys of North Korea. We'd love to have somebody from the KFA. If anyone from the KFA is listening, we'd love to interview you on the NK News podcast, especially Dr. Dermot Hudson. Special hello to our friend Dr. Hudson out there. Did you see him?
We did. I did bump into him outside of the Mayday Stadium, and I presented myself and tried to do an interview with him, but he stated that it was his policy not to do interviews with NK News. So unfortunately, we didn't get an interview with him. But we did, however, interview 4 or 5 varying types, from friendship associations, other countries who are there. And that was actually really interesting to hear their stories about what's motivated them to come to DPRK. The most notable one was a chap from the Philippines who was leading a delegation, and I asked him what he did back in the Philippines, and his answer was, I'm a human rights activist.
Well, hello.
And I said, that's interesting. Like, what types of issues? And he said, I'm really against Duterte's extrajudicial killings, crime and lawlessness and all sorts. And I asked, do you think there's any similar issues that might be taking place in this country? He's like, no, this country is perfect, absolutely no problems. So just fascinating to see someone from that kind of background who is such a supporter of the DPRK system. Really incredible. And of course,
with apologies to our friend Chris Green, that does sound quite ironic, doesn't it?
Yeah. And of course, Gerard Depardieu, the French actor, was there.
Now, is he a Russian citizen now?
I heard from French journalists that he's both Russian and French.
Okay.
But we spotted him in the Yanggakdo, I think the second night we were there, and obviously he's quite hard to miss.
He's a big fella.
He's a big fella, and he was surrounded by his posse. And I very politely approached and asked if I could interview him, and I was told not to take photos or anything like that. And then a follow-up attempt to do that, I was quite sternly warned by his KFA kind of guy that if I continued, I would be in trouble and I'll have a bad time in North Korea.
Gee.
I'm surprised, given that obviously he's not the North Korean police, and is he going to beat me up? I'm not really sure.
Did Monsieur Depardieu speak about his love for North Korea? I mean, do we know why he was there?
I had a rumor that he was essentially a long-time filmmaker, kind of associated with the KFA, the French KFA, had kind of been in contact with him and wanted some help on a film about the country, and I think Mr. Depardieu wanted to go and see the country for himself, but that was just on the grapevine. I'm not sure how true that is. But when we saw him leaving Pyongyang airport on Wednesday, Mr. Depardieu had one of the Kim Jong-il badges. So
he has the portraits on his
he had
chest.
the portraits, and he was wearing it, so he clearly had a good time, I think.
Did he not turn up at the bar at the hotel any night of the week?
He was there quite a lot. I never saw him on the source, though, so maybe he's...
Yeah, I was reading he's apparently had some issues with alcohol consumption and has knocked it on the head. But yeah, we only saw him drinking water, and he did. I also tried to interview him as soon as I arrived, and he
because you're francophone, aren't you?
Yeah, and he very violently, aggressively said, "No way, I will not do an interview." So that didn't go down very well.
And some French journalists I spoke to said he's told them to va te faire foutre, which means go fuck yourself. So,
explicit warning, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah.
Now, did you see any Americans there?
Oh, well, we saw...
Because there is still a travel ban, which we should point out to our listeners, if they weren't already aware. The United States State Department has extended its travel ban for another year, is that right? So technically there shouldn't have been any Americans there. Were there?
Lots of journalists, lots of American journalists, Will Ripley, CNN,
okay,
CBS,
so
NBC.
They have a dispensation, they have an exception to go.
But no, we didn't. I don't think we did see any tour.
No, I mean, everyone I assumed might be American turned out to be Canadian. So
yeah, lots of Canadians there, and interestingly, some Korean, Australian groups, including some pastors. Very, very interesting talking to them.
Could you please go on and expand a bit more on that?
Yeah, well, we saw a group of Korean, older gentlemen and women leaving the Yanggakdo Hotel one morning and decided to interview them. And we knew from the night before one of them was a pastor. I'm not sure what his motivation for going to DPRK was, but one was a former Korea Times journalist who I suspect is South Korean Australian, based in Sydney, and he was telling his story about why he came. His dad was from Nampo originally, so he really wanted to see DPRK with his own eyes. And when I asked, I heard there are some religious folks in your group. How about you? He responded, Juche is my religion.
Wow. Gosh. Now, was he there in his capacity as a journalist of some sort, or was he just there as a...
No, he
as
must
a
have
visitor?
been in his early 70s, I'd say, so
Oh, I see.
retired. But it was like a sort of, I think there's like a senior group of Korean Australians, and he said they decided to go to celebrate the DPRK 70th anniversary.
Wow.
Yeah. We also saw some groups from the Cheonggyeon.
Oh, the Japanese...
The Japanese, which is a little surreal because all of those ladies kind of just look like South Korean ladies.
Yeah.
You mean in terms of hairstyle and
in terms
makeup?
of fashion.
And fashion. Do they no longer wear the white, black, sort of modernized hanbok?
I didn't.
They used to have that as a uniform that the Japanese Koreans did.
I didn't see that. I just saw a lot of perms and handbags.
Okay. Were there any ethnically sort of Korean overseas journalists or media outlets represented there? Like, for example,
that's a good question. We didn't see, for example, Minjok Tongshin, the Korean American pro DPRK news organization.
Tonga Shinbo would have been there, wouldn't they? From Japan?
Chosun Shinbo, you mean?
Sorry, Chosun Shinbo. Beg your pardon.
Yeah, but they weren't in our media room. No South Korean journalists either, which was interesting. Given all the rapprochement, you'd expect there'd be an invite, but we heard from an MOU source that there were none allowed to go, none invited. So that was also quite interesting.
Also, no South Koreans went there illegally, as far as you know.
I mean, possibly in one or two of those delegations, but they wouldn't be.
Normally, the North Koreans would fight them if they did go, right? In past years, they've made a big deal out of here we have somebody from South Korea representing the oppressed human rights of South Koreans or something like that. And then
You're thinking of 88, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm also thinking of 2010 when I was there. There was Han Sang-yeol, who was a South Korean minister, a protege of Moon Hee-kwan, who was there in 88. And we were there, well, we weren't in Panmunjom, but we were in Pyongyang on the day when Han Sang-yeol stepped over the line at Panmunjom to go back to South Korea after a 6-week stay in North Korea, a very long stay. And the second he stepped over that line, he was arrested by South Korean agents, and he was given a 5-year prison sentence in the end for breaching the national security law.
We did, however, see on the day we arrived, there was a South Korean Daehanminguk 737 jet on the parkway, which was there to bring Sahun, NIS chief, and his delegation for that one-day meeting with Kim Jong-un. So,
preceding the parade.
Yeah, got a rare glimpse of that.
That's good. A nice callback. Rare glimpse, of course, being the stock standard word used by a lot of the mainstream media.
I did see a few rare glimpses coming out of social media. There was one a rare glimpse into the isolated Orwellian state, which is
and then which has been posted today, the Daily Mirror, who had sent a journalist there, which we couldn't really understand why. Apparently they have an 8-page world exclusive headline inside North Korea.
Exclusive that 200 other journalists also got.
I do think that the word exclusive has somewhat been diluted in meaning over the years. All right, now, speaking of North and South relations, you mentioned that Sahun was there for a one-day meeting. Today, this very day, September 14th, the Inter-Korean Liaison Office is supposed to open in the now shuttered Kaesong Industrial Complex. Was there any talk of that from either your minders or anybody up in Pyongyang while you were there?
Well, I mean, one of the things that strikes you talking to a lot of the North Koreans is really how poorly informed they are about things that are going on in the outside world. I mean, one North Korean specifically asked me if I could find out the date of the summit for him. And obviously I just looked it up and I told him, and he was very happy. I mean, they don't...
You mean the upcoming summit?
Yeah.
Which is next week.
Next week on Tuesday,
right?
yeah. And he said, can you find that out for me? Because our media doesn't really give those kinds of details. And so I think, when you ask them about inter-Korean stuff, it's all very broad. It's all very, about, our leader is working for the unification of the country. They're not really that in tune with the specific kind of day-to-day in the same way that we might be in the South, I think.
Yeah, and just as an example, the day we did arrive and we saw that South Korean jet, I told our guide, do you know what plane is on the other side of the airport? And he's like, no, what? And I showed him the jet on my camera.
The Korean Airlines?
No, it was a Korean government one.
Oh, I see.
And I showed him a picture of it and he's like, oh, wow, I didn't know that. So it just it does give you a sort of idea of the disconnect between just like actual news events that are taking place on like meters away from you that people just don't know about it.
I was also asked if I'd heard the news that Park Geun-hye had been imprisoned.
Wow. Okay, a bit behind on the news.
Yeah, a little bit.
Mike, I was speaking to somebody earlier this week who was in Rason very recently, and he said to me that his minder at one stage asked him, how do you open a Twitter account, and how do you know if President Trump's Twitter account is real, and how can you make a fake Twitter account, and all this kind of thing, so that's interesting.
Yeah.
Did anyone talk to you about either Twitter or President Trump while you were there?
We got a lot about President Trump. There was a very interesting kind of local fascination with this attempt that Trump had to have a military parade. It was during the North Korean military parade. One North Korean was asking me, what Trump wants to have a military parade. I heard, why didn't it happen? And I explained it was because of the cost, and because obviously a military parade is slightly taboo in the US. It sort of stinks of despotism, and he said, but the Americans are the biggest world military power. Don't they want to show it off? And I said, well, apparently not.
That's interesting. Chad, did you want to talk to you about President Trump?
Yeah, there were some questions about his political power and like how long he may be in power for, things like that. But no, I didn't have a great deal of discussions about him. We did have some really interesting discussions about internal situation in DPRK, and one of the things which came up was from one individual, a rather surprising frankness about some of the electrical problems. So they said that, for example, in their apartment, they live between the 9th or 10th floor, somewhere along those lines, and they said that very seldom is there power, which means you've got a 10-minute walk up the stairs. And I said, what about Ryomyong Street then, where there's a 65 or 66 floor building? And the person said, no Koreans want to live there.
Goodness, that's the street that just opened up with much fanfare last year, isn't it?
Yeah, and we did the calculations, and you'd be looking at a 1 hour walk up the stairs if you were on the 66th floor. Probably actually an hour and a half, because it would become very straining. And they said that they conceded there were water problems because
how do you get water pumped up that high?
Water pump won't work. Even diplomats that I spoke to, even an ambassador level, complained that they hadn't even been able to shower during the 3 days of the parade because the DPRK hosts had kept the schedule so tight and busy that one ambassador said that they had no running water outside of certain windows in the day. Which, if you miss that shower, then, that's that.
One said that he had his internet cut off on a Saturday and not had it back until Monday. Just little connectivity issues as well were quite a feature of the visit, I think.
And Ollie, do you want to talk a little bit about the views of non-Kim Jong-un leadership? Because that was
that was really interesting.
Please.
I was kind of trying to work out a little bit how attitudes about different people in the kind of ruling elite have kind of developed, and so I was asking the locals about that, and it started off, we were talking about Kim Jong-nam, the nominal head of state, and
is he still the president of the People's Presidium?
President of the Presidium of the Supreme People's Assembly.
It's a hard title to remember.
It is, but North Koreans just say, well, in our country he's like the president.
He gave the He gave the
speech at the military parade, and I found a certain degree of humor in North Koreans about some of their top officials. We were talking about Kim Jong-nam, and the North Koreans said, "Well, he'll be dead soon anyway."
He is very old.
He's like a grandmother,
90 plus.
Ri Yong-ho, the foreign minister, one North Korean said, "Oh, in our country we joke that he looks like an egg."
Wow.
So there's almost no deference towards top officials. They're just kind of seen as old bumbling coots.
That's interesting.
But and then I was talking to North Koreans about Kim Yo-jong.
Yes. Was she cited at either the parade or the mass games?
She was at the parade, kind of in the background. But Kim Yo-jong, I was talking to the North Koreans about how she'd come here and she'd become kind of famous in the South, and they kind of liked that. but there didn't seem to be much taboo about her. There was a strange taboo, however, about Ri Sol-ju.
The wife of Kim Jong-un.
Well, on one occasion I was speaking to a North Korean and I brought her up, and he said, kind of in hushed tones, "You mean the wife?" And he didn't really want to talk about her. And then Chad got in a little bit of trouble on a visit to a cosmetics factory because he asked the woman running the factory, "Do you think that Ri Sol-ju has influenced the leader to kind of have an interest in this topic?" And the minder refused to translate the question. He said, "We can't ask her that. Don't ask those types of questions."
And then my minder said, "How could you ask that, Chad? How could you ask that question?" And I suddenly realised that I'd indirectly questioned the Supreme Leader's total power and thought-making process, and the idea that his wife may be having even a sort of jovial influence on him to invest more in this cosmetics sector was just like, do not ask.
So I assume then that the remarks that she made around the table with President Moon when they were having dinner at the first summit, where she talked about maybe it wasn't there. It was sometime in meetings with South Koreans, and she talked about trying to get Kim Jong-un to cut down on his smoking.
Oh yeah.
I'm assuming that those remarks would not have been reported in the North at all.
Certainly not.
Yeah, and I mean, one we did. I won't go into the details, but we did get a real sort of insight into some of the more police state aspects of North Korea, and what we saw. There's a lot of these undercover police on the streets that are keeping watch. Sort of neighborhood watch type stuff, but there was one instance where we got a bit of a clear impression of how that works. And what my immediate feeling after seeing this process roll out was that we're seeing all this inter-Korean rapprochement. There's on the surface like interest in inter-Korean exchanges and South Korean tourists going back to DPRK, and Kim Jong-un has even called for it from the very top level. But seeing that kind of police state that is just below the surface, pretty much everywhere you can see, it just made me think, really, hell, there's no way on earth I can imagine DPRK being comfortable with South Koreans roaming around Pyongyang anytime, probably in at least a decade. Like it really hammered home like just how much of a gulf there is between what is said publicly. And I think I even raised it with one of the guides, like that Kim Jong-un had called for all this inter-Korean cooperation for tourists to be traveling back and forth, and he sort of kind of dismissed it as seemed to be implying it wasn't really a serious remark.
But then surely all that investment and construction taking place out in the Kayemaye Peninsula in Wonsan.
Yeah, but you can sanitize it and keep it in a very restricted area. But what I'm talking about is people roaming around freely. And I even asked one guy who I knew that used to be in the tourism sector, how long is it going to be until tourists can walk freely in Pyongyang? It will make a huge difference to your country. Yeah. You're going to get a lot more interest. And he said, 10 years ago, I answered this question to another tourist, and I told them, I think, in 10 years' time. Now, 10 years later, my answer is still the same. It'll be 10 years' time.
That's interesting. That's quite a self-reflexive answer, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, there's still such a degree of paranoia and control about, foreigners walking around and foreigners, going into certain places and just trying to really keep us away from things that they just don't want us to see, especially on a big event, a big anniversary where they want essentially all journalists to come out with the same cookie cutter stuff.
Yeah, and I guess we can kind of see that a little bit in the Inter-Korean Liaison Office that's about to open up today. I read just this morning, or yesterday actually, that it's a multi-story building, and the North Koreans will be on the second floor, and the South Koreans will be on the fourth floor, and the third floor in the middle will be for the meetings that they have between the two of them. And this kind of ruined the image for me, because I had initially imagined
I thought they would
have an office full of North and South Koreans separated only by low cubicle walls, and you'd have water cooler talk, or you'd have the South Korean, with his elbows up on the cubicle wall talking to his North Korean neighbor saying, "Hey, did you see that football match last night?" Or, "How about that latest blockbuster film or whatever. And that obviously won't be going on because they'll be working on separated by 2 floors.
And one would imagine they'll have to fax each other to prepare a meeting, and like the line is going to go down. It just shows you how far we are in reality from a lot of the types of things that should just be logical and easy to do at this stage.
And yet we are still seeing signs from South Korea that, or at least indications from South Korea that they're quite far ahead of the reality in that, aren't they? That there's a lot of optimism on the part of the South Korean government that real rapprochement is taking place. And
I think no one wants to be left behind if and when it does all happen. Right? I think the idea is that there'll be agriculture ministry is preparing cooperation, and it's not because necessarily they believe it's going to happen now or that they can do it now. It's because if we do get to a situation where it is possible, they don't want to be the people that are just not prepared for it, right? So they will develop all of these plans. The South Korean Ministry of Unification has detailed plans on how they're going to run X, Y, and Z when things change, and I suppose part of that is so when it does change, they can just have a plan already in place.
Right, but we've also got the sort of the other elephant in the room we haven't mentioned yet, which is the international sanctions on North Korea.
Yes.
And there's the question of, does having a liaison office in North Korean territory, is that in itself a breach of sanctions? And there are some suggestion that the hold-up of opening the liaison office, which should have been opened a month or 2 ago, might be partly because of waiting for an okay from the White House, or at least tacit approval. What do you make of that?
Well, yeah, some argue that this constitutes a breach of UN sanctions because obviously the South Korean side has had to move various hardware, building equipment in, much of which almost certainly breaches the HS codes that are used to classify types of materials which North Korea shouldn't be allowed to have at the moment. On the flip side, there's this argument that while foreign embassies in Pyongyang are bringing stuff in all the time, and so therefore why is a South Korean liaison office not to be considered in the same way? Then you have arguments that say, well, the 2 Koreas recognize each other as one, so therefore it's not a diplomatic move or office that's opening. But you could just go on and on. The one thing I think that really came clear from the trip, though, is the luxury goods are everywhere in DPRK right now. Still everywhere.
So we're talking.
There's no shortage. You'll go to shops and it's be full of high quality liquor and expensive
Japanese stuff.
Yeah, Japanese stuff, German stuff. Handbags, shoes, sporting equipment. I mean, it really doesn't feel like there's much impact. But we had a lot of interesting conversations in the north about sanctions and the impact that they have, because the line is that they don't impact us at all, and that we're a nation that's always been under sanctions and therefore doesn't affect us. But then I had a conversation with the factory manager, which I included in an article that I filed from Pyongyang, where he did accept that there had been some difficulties created by sanctions, primarily in his ability to buy machinery from China, which he'd traditionally done. This was in the silk factory. He said he'd bought his machinery from China in the past, but that sanctions had prevented him from doing that. And then he said that has meant that we've actually started developing a domestic industry for this type of machinery, which to me suggested there may be a link between this emphasis on economic development in country and sanctions, and perhaps there's some kind of recognition and acknowledgement that sanctions aren't really going anywhere, and that we need to really just go back to as much economic self-reliance as possible, and we're going to just do this ourselves. Then if we can't buy it from China, we'll make vans, we'll make machinery, we'll make our own cosmetics, we'll make our own luxury handbags, etc., etc.
It is somewhat disheartening that the sanctions don't always work as intended. I mean, you mentioned seeing all these different luxury goods there. Meanwhile, I had a conversation with somebody this week from a non-governmental organization who explained that there's a certain kind of plastic water filter, and you can put almost the dirtiest water through this filter, and out the other end comes potable, drinking water. And this can't be brought into North Korea because of sanctions.
It also says a lot about the regime's priorities, that Lancome, perfume is there, but water filtration is.
But I've got this theory. I don't know if it's true, but I suspect that we've heard a lot from the UN system and from NGOs that they really, really struggle to import a really wide range of things, and that oftentimes Chinese customs is pointed at as being the block on this stuff. Yet you go to the Pyongyang trade fair, the Rason trade fair, just scores of Chinese businessmen selling things like LED TVs, computers, all of which is technically sanctioned.
Dual use.
So they are, the Chinese businessmen seem to have absolutely no problem swanning in with like truckloads of this stuff. But the NGOs, which have humanitarian exemptions, seem to have a lot of hurdles, and it almost makes me wonder if there is some kind of tactical sanctions implementation on the Chinese side, which is designed to create this frustration bubbling up from NGOs who will talk about it to P5 countries at the UN with, from the Chinese perspective, the goal of creating a kind of organic pressure build up to diminish sanctions.
So it's a deliberate crisis creation, perhaps?
Perhaps. I mean, I don't have any evidence to support it beyond just the fact that the business people seem to have absolutely no problem. And I suspect that's why we saw all these luxury goods, because they're just being blatantly and openly brought in. And one foreigner we spoke to just said they've given up on keeping an eye on these things because it's just so prolific now. And I think if you're a US official, you should consider that, because it's clear that part of sanctions doesn't really have any impact.
So we were actually told when we were complaining about the bill,
which bill?
About the bill for the transport, they said, well, don't blame us, you should blame sanctions. And he said, if you want it to be cheaper, lift sanctions. And I obviously had to explain that Chad and I, as much as we'd love to have that power and be in that position, we obviously can't lift sanctions. So.
Overall, I mean, it's been a year and a few months since your previous visit. Did anything look or feel different in North Korea?
Well, I mean, Oliver's just alluded to one big difference, which when you go on these journalistic delegations, you have a sort of number of fees to pay beyond the hotel bill and your flight. Last year, for 3 of us, for a 5-day tour, those fees came up to about 1,400 euros. This year, for 2 of us, for a 7-night stay, those fees were 2,700 euros. And the biggest difference was the bus. We were charged 170 euros a day for the right to sit in a bus for really quite short trips. And as Oliver said, that was explained away as due to price hikes and on gas, which don't make sense to that level. And yet when we got a taxi a couple times in Pyongyang, it cost like 2 euros on one occasion, 15 on another for quite a long drive. And so it would have been much more cost effective to have a private driver the whole time than go on these buses. But that was a big difference. It did feel a bit more like there was a bit of penny pinching going on. We heard of some journalists being... when we tried to check in, they tried to put us in first class accommodation at the Yangakdo, and we spotted that straight away and got downgraded to just standard classrooms. But
that means you and Ollie shared a room, doesn't it?
Oh, we had separate rooms.
No, but as Chad said, there was a sense that they were trying to rinse us as much as possible. Beyond that, obviously the vibe was very different to when we went last year. There wasn't, last year was just as we were getting into that fire and fury phase. There were a lot of missile tests kind of ahead of us, and last year it felt a lot more like there was a bit more tension. There wasn't the inter-Korean stuff going on. The North Koreans were much more about showing that we're a powerful nuclear power back then. Now they still say that, but it's more about, we have them. We don't need to go on about them anymore.
So the bellicosity was definitely reduced then.
I think it was definitely toned down,
Do you want to, just on a final note there, to our listeners, perhaps give a preview of what to expect in post-visit articles that you'll be writing for NK News or NK Pro?
So for NK Pro readers, we will probably be doing a quite detailed roundup of a really wide range of indicators on things we've seen, things we heard. So expect that. And then I think on NK News we'll do probably another gallery or couple galleries. We've recently acquired a lot of photos taken from Paektu all the way down to Kaesong as of late August through September. So we'll see if there are any interesting trends there. One thing I did notice was men. Every man seems to have a man bag these days. It seems to be a fashion that's
Is it the one that you sort of just hold
clutch
in your hand?
type
A
thing.
clutch, okay,
Yeah.
rather than slung across the shoulder.
Yeah. Very
like a
inconvenient
satchel.
type of bag, I personally think. But yeah.
I was told they're quite fashionable.
I'm a big believer in man bags. But not the clutch style. I think I definitely need something with a long strap.
Yeah. And then, beyond that, we have an event for those of you in Seoul next Friday, talking about the Inter-Korean Summit, and of course...
Yes, that'll be the
next.
next big thing, right? Tuesday, Wednesday. It's a 3-day visit by President Moon to Pyongyang, isn't it?
Yes, 18, 19, 20th, which is it's interesting. I wonder why it's going to be so long, given the...
I think there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
Well, we definitely look forward to that. And so the event, you say, is next week, Friday.
Yes,
For
for if you're an NK Pro subscriber in Seoul, get in touch and we can send you the details.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks again to Ollie and Chad for coming in and talking to us today for our rough and ready post 70th anniversary party podcast. And listen again next week, listeners, to our interview with Martina from the Swedish Embassy.